Yeah, of course.
Leaving February.
Yeah, right. So we'll get. Either one. George, same for you if you want to sit down or go there. Either will.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming out on approaching Snowmageddon again. We're going to start momentarily. I'm Nina Shea. I direct the Center for Religious Freedom at the Hudson Institute, and I'm very pleased that this is our inaugural event for Hudson's 50th anniversary year. And we have a panel here of very dear friends of mine and our guest speakers. Long-term friend George Weigel, who is an advisor to the Center for Religious Freedom, and Senator Marcello Pera from Italy, of course, who has also been a colleague of ours at Hudson. We've had the honor of having him for the last couple months. But my colleague, Paul Marshall, is going to do a proper introduction. So with that, Paul, can you please come to the podium?
Okay.
Let me just remind everyone that we are broadcasting or taping this live. It's on our website, and you will be able to download it yourself and view it if you care to. And there will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the discussion. And all we ask is that you please identify yourselves and before asking questions, and at this point to turn off your cell phones. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nina. Just on the point of questions, one other request, there will be a handheld mic. And so if you would hold off on your question until you're given the mic, we can probably hear you, but again, it's since we're recording, we'd like you to speak into a microphone as well. It gives me very great pleasure to be able to chair this session, and because we have two very distinguished guests. I will introduce them both now at the beginning. Marcello Pera is an Italian philosopher with much writing on philosophy of science and religion and philosophy of science. He is also currently a senator in Italy and formerly a president of the Italian Senate. He's also a very amusing raconteur, and we who've had him at Hudson as a visiting fellow have very much enjoyed his presence. Currently, while he's at Hudson and in Washington, D.C., he is writing a book entitled Science and Religion, Politics and Faith, on the origins and foundations of secularism. This volume follows his 2008 book, Why We Should Call Ourselves Christians, Liberalism, Europe, and Ethics. That book is in Italian. It will shortly appear in the United States in English. And that book also includes an introduction by the now Pope Benedict XVI. We have asked George Weigel to respond to Senator Pera. George Weigel is a distinguished senior fellow and William E. Simon Chair in Catholic Studies at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington. He is a Catholic theologian and one of America's leading public intellectuals, writing extensively on Christian faith, international relations, and war. Perhaps he is best known for his monumental biography of John Paul II. He has also written on the subject we're discussing today of Christianity and European identity in his book, The Cube and the Cathedral. His most recent book is The End and the Beginning, Pope John Paul II, The Victory of Freedom, The Last Years, The Legacy, which chronicles John Paul's struggle with communism and recounts the tumultuous last years of his life. We're very happy to have both these accomplished gentlemen here. And Senator Pera, I would ask you to begin.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul, for the presentation. Thanks, Nina, for organizing this meeting. Thanks, Ken, for hosting it. And of course, thank you all for being here. You know the title of this meeting, How Necessary is Christianity in European Identity? Now, this question has now an official answer. During summer 2010, 3 million calendars of the new year have been distributed by European Commission with all the festivities except the Christian ones in it. Meanwhile, the European Court of Justice had decided that crucifixes should not be hung up in schools. And not long before, the European Convention had famously established that Christianity should not be mentioned as one of the roots of European civilization. History repeats itself. In 1793, the French revolutionaries acted the same way. They reformed the calendar and transformed the Cathedral of Notre Dame into the Temple of Reason. Contemporary reports tell us that during the celebrations, a certain Madame Thérèse Maillard, a very attractive actress who was placed in lieu of the statue of Virgin Mary and worshipped as the goddess of reason. A question arises: are we going to relive the same catastrophic consequences of this blasphemous ceremony? My personal answer is, in Europe, some of these consequences can already be seen. I will try to make 2 points, the first more political and the second more philosophical. I will be deliberately schematic so as to allow for a better discussion. I am concerned about Europe, but I have American mind, because I fear that the European malady might be contagious. In the old world, the influence of Islam on European culture has been debated by scholars for centuries and is increasingly a topic of political discussion. In the New World, the contribution of Islam to the American Revolution has just begun to be mentioned. Is the God of the city upon a hill, God forbid, fading away? Is he in the train or being joined by another God? This seems to be inconceivable. But in case Americans were to believe that one God, two gods, no God is the same, Europe can teach them that what is inconceivable today turns out to be real tomorrow. Consider just a few examples. In Europe, Christian symbols are more and more taken as archaeological troves that paying tourists may view, provided no strikes are underway, of course. But if these symbols are exhibited as true testimonies of faith, then they are considered offensive to other religions and possibly concealed. In Europe, all blasphemous expressions against Christianity are permitted, and yet satirical cartoons about Islam are not allowed. In the former case, the freedom of expression is invoked, and one may be celebrated as an artist or as a hero. In the latter case, the criminal code is appealed to, and one's life is at stake. In Europe, the Pope may be invited to give a speech at the university for the inauguration of an academic year, only to prevent him ultimately from going, because, as it was said by professors at the University of Rome who protested, universities are secular institutions. In Europe, the issue of Basque or Northern Irish terrorism may be brought about and mentioned with its proper name, but the expression Islamic terrorism is banned, and fundamentalism may be criticized, but only by using the formula Islamic, Catholic, or other. In Europe, a deceitful and biforked newspeak is adopted. When political authorities and cultural elites try to convince the people that Christianity is a parochial religion and the Christian faith an obstacle to progress, the universal language of human rights is used. But when Islamic communities are addressed, the multicultural language is resorted to. As a last example, but the list could be much more longer, in Europe, the principle of dialogue is professed and continuously invoked. But the basis of all dialogue, that is reciprocity, is never mentioned. The outcome is that if Muslims request permission to build a mosque alongside a Roman or medieval basilica, they have their right to be respected. But if Christians are denied the permission to erect even a small chapel in a neighboring Arab or Islamic country with which we maintain normal relations, then is their culture. So the game for Christians amounts more or less to this. Heads, I lose. Tails, you win. And if by any chance Christian believers are attacked by fanatics in a friendly country, then this event may be deplored, but only once and under one's breath. What exactly is happening? My short answer is that Europe is paying the price of its secularism. And this is the first point I wish to make. Secularism is no harmless philosophy. It has at least three serious consequences. The first consequence is that it deprives Europe of its religious history, its identity, and even its boundaries. It transforms Europe into a sort of a container which can be filled with any ingredient whatsoever, but with no real amalgamation. Not a melting pot. Because once identity is lost, the energy fusion is lacking as well. Will the peoples of Europe ever be able to say my country or our motherland? No. They may say at the most, this is the shared land in which we happen to live. And a similar land with no roots or sense of belonging is like a supermarket, bank, restaurant. One enters, is served or serves himself, and then leaves as he entered with no further obligations. In absence of an European identity, no political unification is then possible, let alone a European constitution. The second consequence of European secularism is that depriving Europeans from an essential part of their identity, it doesn't allow the integration of immigrants, which is one of the major challenges Europe is facing today. The reason is simple. Integration does not mean merely adding up or setting side by side or putting together different people. It means absorbing them within a common and a shared framework, transforming them from a collective unity into a moral unity. But if secularism denies the main element for creating a common European framework, that is to say, Europeans' historical religion, then it hinders integration. It produces at the most a rainbow society, continually at the risk of ethnic and religious conflicts. There is an objection to this conclusion. The elements for the creation of a common European framework, secularists maintain, do not stem from religion, but are rather provided by certain universal principles and values. And my reply is, where do these principles and values come from? To what tradition do they belong? And if indeed they are part of a tradition, are they not therefore also attached to the Christian tradition? A second objection is usually raised. Not at all, secularists maintain. The elements for the creation of an European identity come from the Enlightenment and tradition and the goddess of reason. Again, my reply is, have the concepts of liberté, égalité, fraternité by any chance been invented by Madame Maillard? Or is it rather the case that the pretty French actress recited in her own way lines read, for example, in the Gospel? Does not this old-fashioned booklet teach that men are son of God, created in his image, and therefore free, liberté, equal, égalité, and united in the same destiny, fraternité? True, it took a long time and many troubles and tragedies to understand this message. But that means that the Enlightenment was late, not that it was new. Actually, it was just one of many ways with which the inhabitants of the heavenly city have tried to reach the city of God. The third and last consequence of secularism is that refers to dialogue, which I've just mentioned. What is dialogue? It is a dispute between people with different views. When does a dialogue take place and why is it resorted to? Well, when disputants are not certain about their views and are prepared to look for a better one and are ready to admit that their original positions might be corrected, amended, or rejected. As Karl Popper wrote, the principle of dialogue is I may be wrong and you may be right, and by an effort we may get nearer to the truth. But if a dialogue goes like this, then religious views cannot be the subject of dialogue, because believers cannot correct them. They are true by faith, and as a consequence, no interreligious or interfaith dialogue in the technical sense can ever be possible. Of course, and this is an important point, dialogue can take place about principles such as tolerance, equality, parity, personal dignity, and so on. But again, these are our principles, the principles of our Christian tradition. If secularism denies the value of this tradition, how can such principles be discussed and defended? If a person comes to us and says, I am a Muslim and believe that women have fewer rights than men, can we really reply, okay, let us dialogue. I am a secularist. I do not believe in anything, or I believe that anything goes. This brings me to my second point. The main philosophical argument for secularism amounts to this. There is no need for Christianity or any other religion because reason is enough to provide us with those fundamental, universal values and ideals that are indispensable to give sense to our lives and to arrange our societies. But how? Immanuel Kant claimed that to establish a liberal state, there is no need to believe in God or in man created in his image. He then replaced divine commandments by the categorical imperatives of a practical reason and tried to connect them to the individual liberty and the liberal state. But in his later years, when he realized that man is no angel because he is affected by radical evil, that is his translation of original sin, he admitted that the liberal state may be established only as a community of believers, precisely like a church, as he wrote in his last book. Thus, the deepest secular philosopher, the most ingenious champion of the principle of man's autonomy, ended up with God. About 20 years earlier, in his notes on the state of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson had held the same opinion. Can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the mind of the people that these are liberties that are a gift of God? John Rawls, as well as Jürgen Habermas, tried to take a further step. He distinguished comprehensive doctrines, such as religious faith, religious views, that are private, from public conceptions of justice, imposing on the former the duty of being translatable into or replaced by the language of the latter. If this is the case, then comprehensive doctrines are admitted and are also welcome, because they reinforce public reason with a stronger religious feeling. But if it is not the case, then comprehensive doctrines are unreasonable and should be set aside. It is apparently like the story of Columbus' egg. The liberal state is freestanding, famous expression by John Rawls, sustained as it is by the mere force of gravity or attraction of a public reason. But things are not this way. Firstly, public reason is not as universal and impersonal and neutral as it seems. The deeper we dig into it, the more we find that it is our reason holding in our countries within our tradition. And secondly, just as Columbus' egg stands up by itself only if we flatten its base, to allow the citizens of Rawls' liberal state to peacefully coexist, it is necessary to compress their religions. But if you compress religions, the result is the egg leaking on all sides. It is a good recipe for cooking an omelette, but not for growing an open society. To conclude, you may perhaps be curious to know what finally happened to the goddess of reason. Madame Maillard became famous as a Hollywood star, but ended up in prison, and her husband was put to death by Robespierre. Mindless as she was, she certainly did not realize that with her tragicomic play, she had inaugurated that long series of disasters Europeans were doomed to face any time they mocked and fought Christianity in the name now of scientific reason, now of race superiority, now of class struggle, now of other pagan idols. After the guillotine season, Europe has had even gulags and concentration camps. Thanks God, that story is over. But if I were a European, I would be concerned. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me begin by offering a word of congratulations to the Hudson Institute on its 50th anniversary. It's hard to imagine Herman Kahn a half century ago worrying about the issues we're discussing today. Herman had more explosive things on his mind, one might say. But times change, and so do think tanks, and I want to commend the Hudson Institute, particularly Nina and Paul, for their outstanding work on religious freedom throughout the world, which really has set the gold standard for this kind of activity, not only here in Washington, but throughout the United States. So thank you, Nina and Paul. That reference to the gold standard was not an advertisement for my colleague John Mueller's economic views, which you may find in his new book. Let me offer here a diagnosis, or if you will, a bit of the epidemiology of the disease, of which my good friend Marcello Pera has described some of the more obnoxious symptoms. And here I want to draw on the analysis of another friend, Professor Joseph Weiler of New York University, a comparative constitutional law scholar of international repute, who also happens to be an Orthodox Jew, and thus can't be accused of having a dog in this fight. Or perhaps he has a kosher hot dog in this fight. Some 8 years ago, the fight in question was the argument quite raucous in Europe, although it got very little attention here in the United States, about whether the preamble to the European Constitutional Treaty, often referred to as the European Constitution, could mention Christianity as one of the sources, not the only source, not even the primary source, but simply one of the sources of contemporary Europe's commitments to human rights, democracy, the rule of law, civility, tolerance, and all that good stuff. The answer, as you know, that was eventually given was no. That can't be mentioned. In the course of that debate, in which Professor Weiler played a very interesting role, he coined the term Christophobia to describe what he saw going on. And Joe Weiler, being a very precise mind, he described this Christophobia as having 8 component parts, which are worth revisiting briefly in light of Senator Pera's description of the disease. According to Professor Weiler, the first component of this Christophobia, and he listed these 8 in no particular order of magnitude or significance, just listed them. The first component of this Christophobia that is such a part of the high culture of Europe derives from the 20th century experience of the Holocaust and the conviction in European intellectual and political circles that the genocidal depredations of the Shoah were the logical outcome of Christian anti-Judaism throughout European history. Thus, a Europe saying never again to Auschwitz and Treblinka and Birkenau and Mauthausen and all the rest must therefore say no to the possibility that Christianity has anything to do with a tolerant, civil, free society in Europe. The second component part of this Christophobia, according to Joe Weiler, is what he called the 1968 mindset. The youthful rebellion against traditional authority that made 1968 a more long-lasting phenomenon in Europe than in the United States continues, he believed, in one form or another, with the graying veterans of 68 now well established in European parliaments, cabinets, universities, literary salons, and the media. And of course, part of the rebellion of 1968 was its rebellion against Europe's traditional Christian identity and consciousness. To complete 1968 through the processes of European integration and constitution making thus meant to complete the erasure of Christianity from any significant place in the European public square. The third component of this Christophobia Weiler proposed was particularly interesting to me because he suggested that it was formed by a psychological and indeed ideological backlash to the revolution of 1989 in Central and Eastern Europe. Here was a nonviolent revolution that did more to expand the zone of freedom and democracy in Europe than anything since the defeat of Hitler, and it was deeply, even decisively influenced by Christianity, preeminently by John Paul II, but also by Lutherans in the old East Germany, Christian Czechs of various denominations, Romanian Baptists, Catholics in Poland and Czechoslovakia, all working hand in hand with their secular fellow dissidents to overthrow the old order and bring democracy to Stalin's external empire. This, Professor Weiler suggested, was a wrenching experience, a revolution for democracy inspired in no small part by Christians and carried out against the embodiment of hyper-secularism in modern politics, namely communism. The shock to the sensibilities of the people of 1968, many of whom, it must be said, were not exactly stalwarts in the anti-communist cause, was severe. Denial in the form of this facet of Christophobia followed, and Professor Weiler suggests follows. The fourth component of contemporary European Christophobia, Joe Weiler suggested, is more overtly political, namely the continuing resentment of the dominant role once played by Christian democratic parties in post-war Europe, not only in places like Germany and Italy, where the Christian Democrats were major players electorally, but in the creation of the European coal and steel community, then the common market, then the European community, and so forth. Years in the political wilderness when Christian Democrats were riding high, combined with a deliberate forgetfulness about the Christian democratic inspiration of the modern European integration project, have left scars on the European left and among European secularists that, according to Professor Weiler, form part of their Christophobia today. Then, in the fifth place, there is, according to Professor Weiler, Europe's tendency to parse everything in left-right terms, and then identify Christianity, which is the right, with the right, which is the party, as the left sees it, of xenophobia, racism, intolerance, bigotry, narrowness, nationalism, and everything else Europe must not be. Surprised he didn't throw baseball in there. The sixth source of contemporary European Christophobia, in Joe Weiler's judgment, again touches on matters in which I'm directly concerned, and that was and is resentment towards Pope John Paul II, evident among both secularists and Catholic dissidents. The Pope's undeniable role in igniting the revolution of conscience that made possible the revolution of 1989 in Central and Eastern Europe, his support for democracy in Latin America and East Asia, his global defense of religious freedom for all, his remarkable reconstruction of Catholic-Jewish relations, his opposition to war and abortion, not to mention his enormous personal authority and his popularity with young people. All of that, Joe Weiler suggested, I think correctly, is very, very hard to fit into the narrative line, the storyline of late modernity or post-modernity as crafted by both European secularists and dissenting Catholics. This just wasn't supposed to happen. Both European secularists and Catholic dissidents insist that the Pope must be, the late Pope or the present Pope, must be a pre-modern man of whom nothing serious can be expected in aid of building Europe's democratic future. The alternative possibility that John Paul II was and Benedict XVI is a thoroughly modern man. These are thoroughly modern men with an alternative and perhaps more penetrating reading of modernity, simply can't be entertained because the storyline would collapse on itself at that point. In the seventh place, and here everyone with high school age and elementary age children in the room can sympathize. In the seventh place, Christophobia in Europe today, according to Joe Weiler, is fed by distorted teaching about European history, which, as often happens here as well, stresses the Enlightenment roots of the democratic project to the virtual exclusion of democracy's historic cultural roots in the Christian soil of pre-Enlightenment Europe. Believers as well as non-believers have internalized this meta-narrative, so it is perhaps little wonder that the preamble to the European Constitution during that debate in 2003-04 once proposed to take a giant leap from the Greeks and Romans to Descartes and Kant in describing the historical sources of contemporary European democracy. I believe the exact language was the classical heritage, the Enlightenment, and modern thought. That is, nothing of significance for 21st century European democracy happened between Marcus Aurelius and Descartes. That's about 1,300 years. It's an awful long time for nothing to happen. It's a preposterous notion, but it's there. And, of course, I suspect many of your kids bring it home from elementary and secondary school here, as well as in Europe. Finally, Professor Weiler suggests, with something of a twinkle in his eye, that the aging children of 1968, now middle-aged and soon to be retired, are upset and confused by the fact that in some cases their children have become Christian believers. Those who grew up Christian and rejected both the faith and the church in late adolescence or early adulthood are puzzled, even angered, by the phenomenon of their children turning to Jesus Christ and Christianity to fill the void in their lives. I actually watched this happen live and in color in France in 1997. I had gone to the World Youth Day in Paris that year to see what John Paul II was up to. And I stayed with some Parisian friends who happened to be involved in planning World Youth Day. And after the event was over, a tremendous success, 1 million people at Mass at the Longchamp race course on the last day, 500,000 kids making the Stations of the Cross through the streets of Paris on Friday night. We went down to my friend's country place in Normandy to recover, so to speak. And then we got there Sunday night, the day that it all ended, and flipped on the television, and there was an absolutely befuddled anchorman on the French national TV trying to interview the late, great, well, it wasn't late then, the great Cardinal Jean-Marie Lustiger, the Archbishop of Paris. And the man just couldn't believe what he had just seen in Paris for the past week. And the Cardinal, who really had his game face on that evening, said, "Don't read your experience into the lives of these young people. You grew up Catholic, abandoned the faith, and have been fighting daddy ever since. These kids grew up with nothing. They've now found something, and they want to explore the meaning of that." At which point we popped open another bottle of champagne. That's the epidemiology. According to Joe Weiler, it seems to me quite persuasive. Let me just say a word now about a possible prescription offered by the present Pope 2.5 months ago, when he went to Spain. Spain, as you undoubtedly know, has what is arguably the most aggressively secularist government in Europe today, the Zapatero government. Pope went on his first day in Spain to the great pilgrimage shrine of Santiago de Compostela in the northwest corner of Spain. It was an interesting choice of a venue, because of those of you who know something about Compostela and its place in European cultural history, know that one of the ways that Europe became Europe, and not simply a congeries of different tribes speaking different languages, etc. One of the ways that Europe became Europe during the Middle Ages was on the pilgrimage road to Compostela, where people met each other and found commonalities that would later enrich the cultural soil from which what we call Europe in its contemporary form grew. So at that very suggestive place, where in fact the pilgrimage tradition is being revived today, with tens of thousands of Europeans walking from the northeast of Spain, across Spain to Compostela every year, some of them Christian believers, others trying to figure out what they are, still others just looking for an interesting walk. But nonetheless, this revival is going on. The Pope had the following to say, which seems to me suggestive, at least worth our discussion in the rest of the time we have together. He said, "I raise my eyes to the Europe that came in pilgrimage to Compostela. What are its great needs, fears, and hopes? What is the specific and fundamental contribution of the Church to that Europe which for half a century has been moving towards new forms and projects? The Church's contribution is centered on a simple and decisive reality. God exists, and he has given us life. He alone is absolute, faithful, and unfailing love, that infinite goal that is glimpsed behind the good, the true, and the beautiful things of this world, admirable indeed, but insufficient for the human heart." Tragically, above all in 19th century Europe, the conviction grew that God is somehow man's antagonist and an enemy of his freedom. As a result, there was an attempt to obscure the true biblical faith in the God who sent into the world his Son, so that no one should perish, but that all might have eternal life. The author of the Book of Wisdom, faced with a paganism in which God envied or despised humans, not unlike the secularist humanism of our own time, the author of the Book of Wisdom, faced with a paganism in which God envied or despised humans, puts it clearly. How could God have created all things if he did not love them? He who in his infinite fullness has need of nothing. Why would he have revealed himself to human beings if he did not wish to take care of them? God is the origin of our being and the foundation and apex of our freedom, not its opponent. How can mortal man build a firm foundation, and how can the sinner be reconciled with himself? How can it be that there is public silence with regard to the first and essential reality of human life? How can what is most decisive in life be confined to the purely private sphere or banished to the shadows? We cannot live in darkness without seeing the light of the sun. How is it then that God, who is the light of every mind, the power of every will, and the magnet of every heart, be denied the right to propose the light that dissipates all darkness? This is why we need to hear God once again to the skies of Europe. May this holy word not be spoken in vain, and may it not be put at the service of purposes other than its own. It needs to be spoken in a holy way. And we must hear it in this way in ordinary life, in the silence of work, in brotherly love, and in the difficulties that years bring on. Europe must open itself to God, must come to meet him without fear, and work with his grace for that human dignity which was discerned by her best traditions. Not only the biblical at the basis of this order, but also the classical, the medieval, and the modern, the matrix from which the great philosophical, literary, cultural, and social masterpieces of Europe were born. Let me close with one final thought taken from Pope Benedict's predecessor, John Paul II. The last major teaching document of John Paul II was called The Church in Europe. It was issued in 2003, and I take it to be the last developed statement of John Paul's social and political thinking, his last analysis of the future of democracy. And in it, he raises a question that is not frequently raised in public life, but is nonetheless worth pondering. The Pope, who of course grew up during the horrors of the Second World War, who lost many friends in the Shoah of European Jewry, had, I think, a very profound sense that all of the horrors of the mid-20th century, the ones I just mentioned, to which could be added, of course, the Gulag, the Ukrainian terror famine, etc., 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 had torn a terrible rip, if you will, in the fabric of the human condition. And Europe in particular, I think he believed, was suffering from the burden of an unprocessed and unresolved and indeed inarticulate and unidentified guilt over all of that. And because Europe had in the 19th century thrown the God of the Bible over the side in the name of human freedom, there was no one to whom that guilt could be confessed and from whom forgiveness could be received. At the base, then, of the cultural malaise, the civilization of cultural morale, as I've described it in Europe, is this horrific experience of a great tear in the fabric of late modernity and an inability to repair that tear because of the rise of this aggressive secularism that Senator Pera described so well. That's worth thinking about. That's not the usual way we think about the rise and fall of nations and civilizations, but if culture really is at the root of politics, then it is a thought worth pondering as we consider the future of Europe, which is, of course, where all of us, or most of us, came from, and as we consider the future of the United States, which is Europe transplanted, and as I always say on this side of the Atlantic, Europe improved in the process. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for those two excellent presentations. We'll now open the floor for comments and questions. Again, just as a reminder, when you ask a question, will you first identify yourself? And let me check. Phil, is there a microphone? Yes. And wait with your question until the microphone comes. Okay, at the back, Michael.
Having just come in,
Michael Horowitz, Hudson Institute.
Having just come in for your comments, George, I apologize if I'm raising something that has been mooted, but I wonder about Protestantism in Europe. This just seems to me a kind of focus on the church as if that was the sole instrument of Christianity, and I wonder whether there are, with the Catholic Church, of course, compromised by the scandals and the mounting scandals, I wonder whether there is not, and if not, why there is not, a vibrant Protestantism, an evangelical Protestantism in Europe of the sort that Peter Berger has discussed is transforming Latin America.
Well, Michael, as that great political philosopher Lenny Bruce famously said, there's only one church that's the church. The liberal Protestant project in Europe as a culture-forming project is over. It ran its course over 450-some years. There is not the slightest bit of demographic evidence that it has a future beyond the private sphere of individual conviction. It's one of its great expressions, of course, the World Council of Churches at Geneva, was a great problem during the last years of the Cold War, as we know. I think the more interesting, perhaps, possibility is what about orthodoxy in Europe? Now, this is a big question. The largest orthodoxy in Europe is, of course, Russian Orthodoxy. Russian Orthodoxy was deeply damaged by the experience of communism, during which most of its leadership was a wholly owned subsidiary of the KGB. Indeed, the present Patriarch of Moscow, Kirill I, went to Geneva, to the World Council of Churches, at age 25 as a newly ordained priest, and could only have been sent there by the agents of Soviet intelligence. Now, one hopes that Kirill, who's a very intelligent and sophisticated man, has disentangled himself from those previous political involvements, but his attempting to provide a kind of spiritual covering fire, if you will, for Putin-esque revanchism throughout the old Stalinist outer empire and inner empire is not altogether reassuring. The other problem is that the orthodoxy that is vital in Russia is anti-ecumenical. This is again one of the weird facets of the Cold War, because ecumenical activity was identified with the KGB-dominated elements of the Russian Orthodox hierarchy. Those genuine Russian Orthodox believers who wanted a reformist, engaged, publicly vital Russian Orthodoxy would have nothing to do with ecumenism during that period, and have carried many of those instincts with them into the 21st century. I think there are enormous spiritual and cultural resources in Eastern Christianity, not only in Russia, but in parts of the Balkans, Greece, etc. But it's not easy to see where real culture-forming energy comes from out of that world right now. Then there is the Anglican circumstance, which, as you know, is rather not in good shape in the UK at this point. So can one imagine a Lutheran revival or a Reformed/Presbyterian revival? Perhaps, but there's very, very little evidence of it right now. Very little evidence of it right now, I'm afraid. That's not a happy business.
Thank you. If I may just add a couple of demographic comments on that. It's not my field, so if someone knows more about this, correct me, but I believe in terms of church attendance in Europe, that's across the board, including all groupings, that bottomed out in 2001 and has been increasing ever since. It's from a very low base. You're still talking about 6, 7, 8% of the population, at least of Western Europe. But at least that has been increasing. One factor in that is immigration. Most people in the city of London who are in church on a Sunday are not white. And the largest congregation in Europe is a Pentecostal church in Kiev whose pastor is Nigerian. So you're getting growth in a lot of immigration sectors, pulling people in, a lot of Pentecostal charismatic growth. Again, what might be the cultural effect of that we can discuss, but that is one phenomenon taking place. Oh, sorry.
Joe Bosco, the secularism you describe in Europe is you put in terms primarily of anti-Christian or even anti-fundamentalist.
Louder.
The secularism you describe in Europe is takes on an anti-Christian tone in the presentations we've heard today. I wonder then why Europe seems to be so welcoming to Islam, which is clearly as fundamentalist as Christianity has been in the past, and as spiritual as well.
Well, the situation with secularism, there is a sort of paradox, because many secularists in Europe have a very critical attitude against Christianity, but they don't have the same attitude against Islam. Sometimes you can see this sort of game using Islam against Christianity for secularist reasons. And this is a paradox that's going on. My view is that the real clash, because there is a sort of clash in Europe between among religions, is not so much between Christianity and Islam, but between secularism and Christianity. That may provide an explanation why many secularist intellectuals use Islam against Christianity. They play that sort of game. They tend to side with Islam. They tend to depict them as people who are spoiled by the Christians and people in the minority, people who do not enjoy freedom of religion or don't enjoy human rights, and that because the fight is against Christianity. I think that George was quite right. There are many reasons for that. The 8 reasons mentioned by Professor Weiler. There are many others. For example, I would sum up them saying that in Europe we are living a phase of a sort of guilt syndrome. We feel guilty about everything. We feel guilty because during the centuries we fought Islam. We feel guilty because we had wars of religion. We feel guilty because we have been colonialists and so on and so forth. And in many cases, most of these guilts are attributed to, continue to be of the Christian or Christian origin. So the game, the cultural game now is deprive Europe with its own historical tradition, try to invest Islam as a new possible source of spirituality, because many of these Muslim people are attend ceremonies, they have a strong religious feeling, and play this game, use them against Christian culture and tradition.
Let me add a couple of notes to that. It's worth flagging, because it's a very serious problem, that what Joe Weiler calls Christophobia, the rise of that phenomenon, has been paralleled by a recrudescence of some of the foulest anti-Semitism in the world. It's a kind of package deal. And that, in turn, has led to, even as it has been fed by, some genuinely insane views of the politics of the Middle East. This is a real problem throughout European high culture today. And then I would suggest that part of the difference in the response to Islam is fear. In December of 2007, I was invited to the European Parliament in Brussels to address groups of members of the European People's Party, which is the coalition of Christian democratic parties throughout the continent. And essentially, I was brought over to try to put a little oomph into their public presence in Brussels in the European Parliament. At one otherwise very pleasant luncheon, one of these parliamentarians said in so many words, look, we've lost and we know it. We can read the demographics every bit as well as Nick Eberstadt can, and we know we've lost. And we're negotiating the terms of surrender, and don't you Americans come over here and make a mess of this by womping us up, getting us agitated about the threat of aggressive Islam. We're cutting the deal right now, and we don't want any interference in that. Now, I don't propose that that's a majority view, but that this man from a Christian Democratic Party sitting in the European Parliament would say things of which my description is only a mild exaggeration, was a pretty dramatic business. And I would not at all discount the fear factor here. That certainly has something to do with the corruption of British and French law by Islamist demands. And then that, of course, as I say, feeds back into this recrudescence of an anti-Semitism that one had thought had been expunged after the Second World War.
Father Marcel.
Thank you. I was trying to think of how to ask this question in a short manner, but I don't know if I will be able to. I want to push back a little bit, George, on Weiler's thesis on Christophobia. As you know, this term has been making a little bit of inroads in international organizations, and I would say some high-level officials in the Catholic Church have started to use the term Christophobia and actually institute it into law as something that could be adjudicated to, prove some kind of criminality. I'd like to push back in this regard. I'll shorthand the question because it's difficult. Part of the realization of the deconstructionist project of postmodernism has been the deconstruction of the rule of law. That is to say that the notion that the equal application of law for all people is discriminatory because there is no ends, it's a neutrality of ends in democracy. That is to say everybody can give its own meaning to their project of life, and this must be guaranteed by law. I raise this as a problem because what it has created is sort of the politics of identity, of recognition. The rule of law is no longer the rule of law, but it's biographical. And this has raised problems in Europe, such as the attempt to adopt Sharia law and parallel systems of law in many countries, because their project of life is different. That's their culture, so they require a new rule of law for their project. I'd just like to indicate for sort of reflection that I would not go so fast on this term Christophobia, because it moves in the same exact direction. It is not necessary for me as a Christian to know why my car was stolen, simply that there is a debt of justice that private property was stolen. I think the second problem it presents, it doesn't matter if it was because they don't like Christians. That is irrelevant, it seems to me, to the rule of law, and it moves in the direction of biographical notions of the rule of law, which I think are moving in the same direction that the postmodern deconstruction project of the rule of law was intended to move. Secondarily, your burden of proof increases tremendously because now you have to prove an actual phobia of Christians, which is an irrational fear of something, and it diminishes the guilt of those who do it. And finally, at a practical level, I think you will be left with homophobia and Islamophobia and not Christianophobia or Christophobia. So I think it's not a good direction to move in, and I think it's bad law, and we should definitely stop that. I don't think it helps religious freedom at all moving in that direction. What do you think?
Well, I don't want to overuse this. I mean, I'm using it analytically, not prescriptively in terms of legal system. Well, I don't see any laws against Christophobia enacted in Europe or in Brussels these days. So if it's happening very much below the radar screen. I think what's happening far more dramatically is the kind of thing that's happening here, and that is a move towards privatizing religious freedom, to reducing religious freedom to freedom of worship, and stripping away from religious communities the claim that they have a legitimate role in shaping the public discourse in the public square on matters of public consequence. I think it's probably not a good idea for Christians to whine about Christophobia a lot, because it does sound like whining. But it can sound like whining. But as an analytic tool to try to understand what exactly is going on here, I think there is something to be said for this. Of course, it seems to me the real problem you're describing is a whittling away of free speech, and a whittling away of the notion of a robust public arena in which obnoxious things can and will be said without leading to litigation. That's a problem, obviously, it seems to me. But whether it's wise for the present Pope to use this word or not, I think he's used it once that I'm aware of. I don't pretend to know. I was struck that he didn't actually use it correctly, if I may be so bold as to say. He talked about Christianophobia, which is not the Weiler etymology here. Perhaps there was a bad translation. But to identify with whatever language a problem that is a very real problem, which is not only one of institutions, but of let's say, the public mental health of a culture, in which a problem in which with which we're not unfamiliar here, namely the notion that religiously grounded moral argument has no place in a pluralistic public square. This needs to be named for the undemocratic business that it is. Now, as many of you know, I have spent the last 30 years arguing for the use of public reason in the public square. I am not really interested in providing biblical proof texts for my notion of what the highest marginal tax rate should be. I'm interested in making, arguments that can be engaged by others, irrespective of their theological position. And I think all religiously situated people are well advised to do that. But when those rational arguments, as they so often are here in the United States when it comes to life issues, are dismissed as the imposition of religious conviction in a pluralistic society, then you have to say, no, I'm sorry, that's wrong.
Okay. Sorry.
Just one word about the Christophobia concept. I think it's just a descriptive concept. I don't think that does really have any much explanatory power. You just describe the things. You see people, or mainly intellectuals, some politicians, reacting against Christian teachings, against the church. So it's becoming popular because it's been accepted by people within the church. So we say Christophobic. I think it's another expression, which is older than that, is the disenchantment. Max Weber expression about Europe, disenchantment of the world. So this is the country of Europe. So I think the description is fair. It doesn't imply any normative claim, and it doesn't imply any, and you cannot draw any conclusion about what we should do, what we can do, because it's obvious that there is a fight against Christianity, and we should react. And the problem is that this, I think, is one interesting aspect of the story in Europe now, to try to convince those who are outside the church, secular in a healthy way, for sense, that their fight, the fight for human dignity, equality, fundamental rights, and so on and so forth, is the same as the fight of the church. But here is a problem, a serious problem. Because when you go to Europe and you speak about the church, there it means the Catholic Church, it's not easy to become allied with the church, because then a lot of European history is against you, because not always the church has been in the right place in the right moment. There are countries, including my own country, which became a nation just fighting against a sort of a cultural war against church. So now it's not easy for people like myself or many others, or a few others, probably not many, to say, oh, okay, but we are in the same boat. We are fighting the same cultural war, because what is at stake is not just the church, but human rights and so on. It's the civilization, in one word. So that is the most difficult aspect of a possible prescription, what we should do, or what we could do in Europe, because to join forces, there are suspicions everywhere. Joining forces is not easy, as everybody knows. Just coming to Europe and talking about the church. The church has played different roles in different countries. In Italy, they didn't play a very progressive role because it was against the unification of the country. In Poland, the situation was quite different. And so we have to go around and to find people who are interested and to convince them that we are fighting the same and the same fight, in the sense that we are fighting in order to save and to keep our civilization, because it's that civilization which is at stake. And that's why I believe also that is also a fight for non-believers. Third part.
Sounds vaguely like bonsai. What's going on?
I have no idea. Hillel? Correct?
Hillel Fratkin, senior fellow with the Hudson Institute. Let me begin by saying it's lovely to see an old friend, George Weigel, here again. And also to say that it's been a very great pleasure to have Senator Pera, Marcello, if I may, as a colleague. And Mike, I have a question really to Senator Pera. It's in a way two related questions. One is, you've spoken largely about secularism, and I wondered whether your description of what the state of play is at the moment, what you mean by secularism isn't really liberalism, and not every form of secularism. Though obviously secularism of different varieties played a role in the 19th and parts of this 20th century, of the 20th century. But that right now it's liberalism that of a classical variety that you mean when you speak of, for example, the ways in which people shift grounds in discussions. Sometimes they're liberal, sometimes they're on. They want to criticize the church from the perspective of human rights, and other times from the perspective of multiculturalism. And I suggest that because it seems to me more accurate to describe the particular form of hypocrisy you were complaining about before, that one jumps from a liberal perspective to a multicultural perspective. But also to ask you this question. Earlier, both of these things, both liberalism and multiculturalism, could be understood as derivative from the European tradition, and specifically the Christian tradition. And here, it seems obvious to affirm what you said earlier, which is that you can't really understand European identity, certainly of the past or the present, without Christianity. But insofar as that is asserted, how do you mean to? In what way do you want to deploy that relationship between either liberalism or multiculturalism and the Christian tradition? How, especially as they are now in some sort of conflict with one another. That would be my question. I also want to make two observations. One pertaining to the subject that George brought up, of the rise of or return of European anti-Semitism with Muslim twist, and it does seem to me that as far as European future is concerned, it will not have a Jewish component for very much longer. There are only two substantial Jewish communities left in Western Europe, in Britain and France, and those communities, many people in them know that they are increasingly unwelcome in Europe, and they or their children will find other places to live. The other observation that pertains more to so however Europe works out its future, it's going to be without any kind of Jewish input, as we say. The other thing I wanted to observe also was about this issue of the relationship between contemporary European identity and a Christian past. One of the things that seems most striking and so bizarre about this divorce is the following. Today, people speak of Europe as a totality, as a common entity, as something that could have an identity. a common identity. The only time I know of when any people spoke in the same terms was in the Middle Ages, on the grounds that it had a common identity, which was called Christianity. Now, at a minimum, it seems to me that people who want to explore what a common European identity would mean today have to appreciate that fact, and they might even want to look at it for its pluses and its minuses.
Yeah, thank you. Identity first. The problem of European, especially now that they're trying to build up European Union, about the identity is the following. Either there is an identity, I mean, there is something European shared, and you can mention it. And then you can have a political unification, because if there is an identity, then there is one people, and there is one country, and then you can have one constitution and European unification. It's not by chance that the idea of the European political unification started after World War II, especially by an initiative of three Christian Democrats, Adenauer, Schuman, and de Gasperi. They started with a few countries, just a few countries, and if you read their correspondence and their speeches at the time, they had was quite clear in their mind that they were trying to unify the Christian area of Europe. So the political unification of those 6 countries at the beginning was not disconnected from the religious identity. Now, if you deny that there is an identity, and if you deny that religion is an essential part of the identity, it's quite difficult to have a political unification. So you just build up a document. You draft a document, you call it a constitution, but then it doesn't work because people don't feel it. So that is a serious issue, because the alternative, say, no, there is no real identity, historical identity. That means that the best European countries can do is to reach agreement among themselves and build up a few shared institutions, but forgetting about the unification. That is an issue. And those prime ministers, heads of state who denied the possibility of mentioning Europe in the preamble of the Constitution, I think that they represent a serious threat to that very European unification they claimed they want. So this is an issue, and since we have a lot of dispute along the centuries in Europe and wars, the only element where you can refer to in order to find an identity is just Christianity. Okay, we'll see, because if there is no identity and if the secularist attitude is prevailing, then you undermine Christianity, but at the same time you undermine the only element you have to build up a European identity. Now, the question of liberalism is very intriguing, and I thank you for raising it. I mean, usually we take it for granted that liberalism implies a secularism, it implies multiculturalism, and you didn't mention it, but sometimes people believe that liberalism also implies relativism. Now, in a way, it's true. I mean, about the secularism, a liberal state is a secular state. It's not a theocratic state. It doesn't impose a religious faith. Is, as we say, independent from or neutral with respect with all the faiths of the citizen. That's true. So I agree with those who make this implication. Liberalism implies a secularism, right? Because liberalism implies a tolerance, and it implies a citizenship, and if you want to allow a room for tolerance and citizenship, you have to be secular, right? My question is different. what are the very foundations of the liberal state? Because that a liberal state is impose anything, that's fine. I agree with that. But what are the foundations, the conceptual foundation of that state, which is asked not to impose anything and to respect the tolerance? My answer, I try to explain in my books, is that view, that foundation of that state stems from a tradition. And that is a Christian tradition. It grew up within that tradition. It didn't grow up in a secular vacuum. It didn't grow up in Islam. It didn't grow up in India. It grew up in Europe. Historical proof, people like John Locke or Immanuel Kant. These are the best, and the most famous liberal thinkers we have in the West. They were both liberal. They both were secular, but they both stressed the importance of Christianity and the idea of a natural law and the idea of a covenant between the people and God. And from that idea, they drew the conclusion of the liberal state. So even from a historical point of view, we have thinkers in Europe and the West who link liberalism with Christianity. And I am concerned by the fact that if we undermine Christianity, then the liberal foundation of our states are at risk. And this is something that's up in Europe. I don't know whether this is something that's up in America. What about that? And what is trying to cheer me up and tell me, oh no, don't worry, America is immune from this disease. We are liberal and Christian. We are liberal and multicultural, and so on and so forth. I'm not really sure about that. And not because there are some fashionable New York intellectuals and some fashionable European intellectuals that speak more or less the same language. No, I feel something else, as if something in our culture is fading away. We are losing the sense that our fundamental liberties are linked to religious faith. Just that faith, not other.
I just might throw in a couple of thoughts on that, Hillel. Thank you. John Adams famously said that the American Revolution took place in the minds of the American people before it took place in events on the ground, so to speak. And I think that's what we're coming to understand did not happen in the period 45 to the present in Europe, despite a great amount of, I think what has to be conceded, was very useful institution building. The coal and steel community, then the common market, and the European Union in its earlier form, these were useful things. They have preserved the peace between the West Franks and the East Franks for a very, known as French and Germans, for a very long time now, which was precisely the point, as one might remember. It was said of NATO that the idea is to keep the Russians out, the Germans down, and the Americans in. Well, the point of these institution-building enterprises of de Gasperi, Schumann, and Adenauer, very much informed by mid-20th century Catholic social doctrine, was to keep the East Franks and the West Franks from being at each other's throats for a third time that might finish everything. It's been very successful in that. It provided an enormous period of economic growth that has been very impressive. Now it's running into all sorts of fiscal problems, not least because of the demographics, which are truly appalling, and I think raise the deepest questions of all about the health of contemporary European culture. When an entire continent stops having children and does this as an act of will, this is not a natural catastrophe, this is not a sudden plague of infertility, et cetera, et cetera. It's a willful act. People have decided not to create the human future in the most elemental sense. I mean, you really have to say what is going on here. So while there's a lot of discussion in Europe, as you know, about a democracy deficit in Brussels, and I think that's all true, and very, very worrisome, this kind of top-down bureaucratic form of the emerging EU. The identity deficit or the morale deficit, it seems, the cultural morale deficit, seems to me to be even more fundamental. And while, you know, I suppose as an abstract, what if, you know, I could imagine some efflorescence of classical political theory of the sort one saw here between 1760 and 1810, more or less, you know, providing some conceptual glue to, or conceptual impetus for a genuine renewal of culture that would then fill these new structures. I don't see it happening. So I mean, I think it's either a one of those unexpected, but nonetheless these things happen in history, revival of the Christian reality of Europe, or it's a slow and perhaps not so slow descent into the twilight. And then we have to start thinking about whether maybe Bat Yeor was right about the future. Let me also say, Hillel, that I think what you say about the Jewish future in Europe is both true and terribly sad. And when you see this unfolding, even when there are figures of the genuine distinction, intellectually, spiritually, of a man like Jonathan Sacks in Britain, the chief rabbi, now Lord Sacks. Why a rabbi would want to be a lord, I'm not sure. It seems to me an inferior title. But the inability of a witness like that to blunt the emergence of this really nasty stuff is pretty depressing, frankly, and I don't think would be tolerated here. I think, you know, the kind of stuff that is said in Europe, people would get run out of town for, or end up writing for giveaway newspapers in McLean, Virginia, to take a recent local example, namely Helen Thomas.
Okay, at the front here, and then we have two more back.
Thank you. Steve Landy, Manchester Trade. I found this fascinating. I'm sorry I came a few minutes late, so if this was already asked or covered, you don't forget it. But to me, I always viewed the European Union came about. Of course, France and Germany got together, said we can't have another war. The French said, I want to sell my agricultural products someplace. The Germans said, fine, I want to get my industrial products. They did a very basic deal. And other countries wanting to join as part of this economic union joined. So my question is, and I don't know, I've never looked at it in terms of religious, this or that. Two big threats that are going on now, or two big issues. Number one is Turkey's desire to, or at least the discussion to get Turkey into the European Union. Again, do we want the Turkish plumber working, you know, having free movement, working in France or some other place? And of course, there's now the new threat from China, and what does that really mean for the future? And again, I never hear this being discussed either in terms of Muslim, Christian, or in terms of non-religion Christian, whatever's going on with China. So my real question is this really something of a bunch of philosophers saying, oh, there has to be some back after the fact, or is it something going on, and what effect will it have? Is the problem Turkey religious, or has to do with economic? And of course, is Chinese threat looked at more than an economic threat? Or at least a country that feels that it's built on.
thank you. Well, first, the question of France and Germany. I mean, yeah, there are many people in Europe who believe that European Union, at least the institutions of the European Union, can be explained in terms of the history of France and Germany. When after World War II, the people I mentioned started saying we have to build up unification of part of Europe, and they said no more war. Of course, the reference was no more Franco-German war. There are also some cynic people saying that the European Union is a sort of peaceful instrument with which Germans and French continue to make war with each other. Okay, that's an historical explanation. It's true, and that also gives you an explanation why we had after World War II, after the beginning, some period in which unification seemed to be very close, and other which it was completely lost. And that had really to do with the relationship between France and Germany. Consider, for example, how frightened France was after at the moment of the collapse of the Berlin Wall, at the moment of unification of Germany. So I leave it to historians and politicians to give an explanation. The question of Turkey is a serious question, is a serious issue. Because again, this is in a way simple, okay, because if Europe and the European Union is considered to be a sort of a container, as I said before, okay, you put different countries and people together and you give them common institutions with which they can deal their own affairs, financial, economical, fiscal, and so on and so forth. Well, of course, Turkey can join the European Union. But if you speak about the European Union, about Europe in terms of political unification, with the identity of what we were mentioning before, that is quite obvious that Turkey doesn't belong to Europe, because it comes from another civilization. We may have the best possible relationship with Turkey, and of course we need the best possible relation with Turkey with much interest for a lot of reasons, but that does not mean that that part of Europe belongs to Western Europe, the original members of. So there is the problem. Countries promised Turkey that Turkey could join the Union. Now we started having religious tensions in Europe, Christians and Muslims, and of course people are starting being afraid of so many Muslims, 80-90 million Muslims, joining the European Union. Consider, for example, that in the European Parliament, Turkey would have the biggest political group, bigger than Germany. So the discussion is going on. The politicians are not saying the truth, because if you ask people, sometimes, if you ask, I don't saying the truth, why we have all these problems with Turkey, why Turkey has not joined the European Union yet, and they're not saying the truth because they are talking about different things. And on the other hand, people are afraid of the whole, they don't feel easy. There is another aspect of the story, which is another paradox, a European paradox. So Turkey is considered to be a secular country. Turkish like to depict themselves as a secular. Okay. The paradox is that secularity in Turkey has been kept and maintained by strength of the army after the Ataturk revolution, and now the European Union is asking the Turkish army to step back. So that means that in a way they are putting Turkish secularism at risk. So I don't see any possible solution. As far as I understand, some countries like France have already more or less declared that in the near predictable future, Turkey cannot join the European Union. Others are pressing. The United States is making a lot of pressure. I understand why, but the United States reason is just a mere political reason, of course. It has nothing to do with the construction of the European Union. And so the situation is more or less frozen. We continue to have very good relations with Turkey, sometimes less than very good. But I don't see any chance in the near future, unless you really change dramatically the European institution, any chance for Turkey joining European Union.
Let me just say a word. I have nothing to say about China, except I like dim sum. I have nothing intelligent to say about China, so I'll pass on that. Except to say this, I wish Nick Eberstadt were still here. I remember very well that Japan is #1 business of 20 years ago. Well, that went nowhere, in part for demographic reasons. And my hunch, since Nick has educated me to be a demography bore, or a demography fundamentalist, I suppose, is that the China is #1 thing is got a very short sell-by date on it, precisely for the same reasons. China is about to hit various demographic walls, highly aging population, large numbers of unmarriageable young men because of the one-child policy and what amounts to a genocide of Chinese female babies, and a lot of unresolved political problems. There's lots of restiveness in China, which unfortunately was not discussed very vigorously, it would seem, last week. So I'm less concerned. I mean, in the China-India sweepstakes, my bets are on India. Let me say a word about the Turkish business, which I think is about to become a non-problem. But let me preface that with a word about the U.S. policy, which has been very pro-Turkey in the EU. There's a very simple reason for this. Turkey was, until 2003, a reliable NATO ally, very reliable NATO ally, and was one of those parts of the Islamic world that was not phobic on the subject of the State of Israel. All that's changing. One of the reasons that things unfolded the way they did in Iraq in 2004 and 2005 has a lot to do with the Turkish stance in 2003. I think we're very close to a tipping point in Turkey with the present government, where a process of Islamicization, if you will, is going to become irreversible, whatever the army wishes or doesn't wish to do. And that will mean that Turkey will not be able to meet the human rights standards, particularly on questions of religious freedom, that would be required for EU accession. The Turks do not allow the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople, Bartholomew I, the titular head, if you will, of Orthodox Christianity, to run a seminary in his own diocese. I mean, there are some very, very serious problems on that front. Let me be even more provocative and suggest that it's going to become a non-problem because I'm not sure the EU, in its present form, is a long-term bet. Precisely because of these fiscal problems, which are going to act in centrifugal ways to drive countries further and further apart. So I'm not sure at all that 10, 15 years from now, which is, I think, the quickest any of the more excited pro-Turkey adherents people are talking about, accession. What's going to be there 10 or 15 years from now is not clear. However, just as a hypothetical, I completely agree with Senator Pera that were Turkey to join the EU, were the EU to remain in its present configuration and Turkey to become a member, then we would know that the Schuman de Gasperi Adenauer project was over. The EU would have become simply a arrangement of economic, financial, trading, etc., labor rules for mutual economic benefit. It would have ceased to be a common civilizational project. One way I tried to flag this at the time when this was a real issue, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, was to say, tongue-in-cheek, when they changed the name of Istanbul back to Constantinople, we've got something to talk about. Because that would indicate a certain shift in, what is the reality here. But that's about as likely to happen as my poor Orioles winning the World Series next year. So, there you go. Right, that's right. God is not finished with us yet, as a famous Chicago politician once said.
Okay, well,
so I really think I just think the Turkey thing is more and more a non-question.
There's actually a raft of questions, but I'm just going to, two people have been waiting for a while at the back here and then the second row here. We're low on time, so I'm going to ask you each to ask your question, then ask our panelists to respond to both of them.
I am actually a European, dividing my time teaching at a graduate school on the East Coast, evangelical interdenominational school called Gordon Conwell, and in Central Europe. I'm a native Slovenian, a citizen of Croatia. Senator Pera, we've met once, and I had something to do with encouraging translation of your book in Croatian language. Thank you. And George, before the biography of Pope had monopoly on your life, you've shared about changes in Eastern Europe in the other millennium, long time ago. And saying this, let me say how appreciative I am and the people in my part of the world for what Paul and Nina are doing in terms of human rights and religious liberty. Senator Pera, an admiring effort that you undertake to kind of restore Christian roots for liberalism. I wonder, did you ever have a conversation with the present Pope when he was cardinal? You co-authored things, he wrote a foreword to your later book. There are problems there, especially as you build this alliance with the head of the Roman Catholic Church. One of his predecessors, Leon XIII, I think it was, condemned, if not demonized, liberalism in toto. So it seems to me there is major work to do. And let me just briefly say, since I am an ecumenically minded evangelical, I think, George, you have too quickly passed over the question of Michael Horowitz. I don't think he's in the room right now. There is a kind of an evangelical awakening going on in a number of European countries. In Eastern Europe as well as in Western Europe. There is a mission in reverse going on. Paul mentioned the church in Kiev. The biggest church in UK is pastored by gentlemen from Ghana. And there are African missionaries today in Italy.
Okay, Peter, I must cut you off simply because of time, because it's 2. But that'll give them more than enough to
But I think, just to conclude, I think our major question in Europe is how to renew the credibility of Christian faith. We don't have much justification of being triumphalists again, as it is happening with some Catholic and Orthodox friends in Eastern Europe. And that's where minorities suffer because they're discriminated against again because of the ethno-religious homogenization. Sorry, I know we need a whole symposium on this topic, but thank you for your patience.
Okay, and just one more. Okay, then, thank you very much. We'll just turn Peter Kuzmich's question and comments over to you.
Thanks for mentioning that evangelical renaissance, some of which I'm aware of in Slovakia as well. It is very interesting. Let me just say very briefly, because time is late and snow is coming, that and Americans have become wimps, so that 4 inches of snow sends us all into a panic. Cancels football games, which is absolutely the sign of the apocalypse here. Well, you know, let me say, Peter, that if there is going to be a conversion of Europe or a reconversion of Europe, it will not be by argument but by example. It will not be by argument but by example. The arguments are all in place and they're all persuasive, I think. What is needed is the example of lives lived more nobly, compassionately, humanely, that comes out of Christian conviction. And that's what converted the Roman Empire, was not Tertullian's arguments or Origen contra Celsus or whatever. It was the example of a more humane way of life. I think Rodney Stark's work on this is very persuasive. That's a hard thing for theologians to admit, but he's right. So that's what we're looking for in Europe, I think, are these living organisms, cells of Christian conviction that model a way to be a happier, more fulfilled, more integrated human being. That's what will do the job, if anything will.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Firstly, thank you to our two presenters for very wonderful and informative and insightful presentations. Thank you for the audience for coming out.